You rehearse conversations that never happened, and then you treat them as evidence. A reply you imagine becomes an insult. A reaction you predict becomes a certainty. A judgment you construct becomes a fact. Yet nothing occurred outside your own mind. This is the quiet error, confusing invention with reality. The mind produces dialogue, assigns intention, and delivers verdict, all without witness, without event, without proof. Epictetus warned that disturbance does not come from things, but from our judgments about them. Here, the judgment is built on nothing but imagined exchange. No words were spoken, yet conclusions are drawn. No action occurred, yet resentment forms. What you call understanding is often rehearsal mistaken for reality. The discipline required is severe, to separate what happened from what was merely thought. The error begins at the level of evidence. Evidence, properly understood, requires an external event, something that occurred independent of your interpretation. A statement spoken. An action taken. A verifiable sequence in the world. Without this, there is no ground upon which judgment can stand. Yet imagined conversations bypass this requirement. They simulate an event internally and then treat that simulation as if it had occurred externally. This is not merely imagination, it is misclassification. The mind generates a scenario, assigns voices, constructs responses, and then labels the result as insight. But no criterion of evidence has been met. There is no speaker, no listener, no shared reality. Only projection. The discipline of Stoic reasoning begins by refusing to grant authority to such projections. When you imagine what someone would say, you are not accessing hidden knowledge. You are extending your own assumptions. The imagined reply is constrained entirely by your prior beliefs about that person. If you think them dismissive, the imagined voice will dismiss. If you think them hostile, the imagined voice will attack. In this way, the mind confirms itself. It produces a conclusion and then attributes that conclusion to another person. This creates the illusion of validation. You believe you have discovered something about them. In reality, you have only revealed something about your own expectations. The conversation is circular, you ask, you answer, and then you claim to have learned. This is why such internal dialogues feel persuasive. They are frictionless. No resistance is encountered because no external will is present. The imagined other cannot contradict you beyond the limits you assign. Even disagreement within the scenario is controlled. You decide how strong the opposition is, how articulate it becomes, when it concedes. The entire exchange is governed by your own mind. Under these conditions, certainty becomes cheap. You can arrive at conclusions quickly because nothing interrupts the process. No unexpected response forces revision. No ambiguity requires patience. The result is a sense of clarity unsupported by reality. You feel as though you understand the other person, when in fact you have never engaged them. From a Stoic standpoint, this is epistemic failure. It violates the distinction between what is within your control and what is not. Your thoughts are within your control. The thoughts of others are not. Yet imagined conversations collapse this boundary. They place the other person's supposed reactions inside your domain and treat them as known. This is a form of overreach. You move from I think to they would think, without evidence to justify the transition. The mind extends itself beyond its proper limits and then mistakes that extension for knowledge. This is precisely the kind of judgment Epictetus warns against, assent given too quickly, without examination of whether the impression corresponds to reality. The imagined conversation is an impression. Nothing more. It presents itself with detail, tone, phrasing, emotional charge, but detail is not proof. Vividness is not verification. The more elaborate the scenario, the more convincing it feels, yet its foundation remains empty. There is no event to anchor it. Once this is understood, the corrective becomes clear. You must refuse to treat internally generated dialogue as evidence about another person. It may reveal your fears, your expectations, your biases, but it reveals nothing about their actual thoughts or intentions. To treat it otherwise is to replace inquiry with invention. The Stoic discipline requires a stricter standard: no conclusion without event, no attribution without interaction, no judgment without evidence. The error does not remain abstract, it produces consequences. Once an imagined conversation is accepted as evidence, it begins to influence behavior. You adjust your actions not in response to what has occurred, but in response to what you believe would occur. This is a decisive shift. Conduct is no longer grounded in reality, but in projection. The mechanism is subtle. You anticipate rejection, so you withdraw. You predict criticism, so you become defensive. You expect indifference, so you withhold effort. In each case, the behavior appears justified, because it is responding to a scenario that feels real. But the scenario has no external basis. It exists only as a constructed dialogue within the mind. Thus action becomes detached from fact. This detachment creates a feedback loop. The imagined conversation produces a conclusion. The conclusion shapes behavior. The behavior then influences the actual interaction, often in ways that resemble the original projection. When this happens, the mind interprets the outcome as confirmation. But the confirmation is false. You do not confirm the accuracy of your prediction, you confirm the influence of your behavior. The result emerged not because the imagined conversation was correct, but because it guided your conduct in a way that helped produce a similar outcome. This is how projection stabilizes itself. Consider the internal sequence. First, you imagine a dismissive response from another person. Second, you adopt a guarded or distant posture in anticipation. Third, the other person responds to that posture, perhaps with confusion, perhaps with reduced engagement. Finally, you interpret their reaction as evidence that they are indeed dismissive. At no point did you test the original assumption directly. Instead, you created conditions under which your expectation could appear validated. The imagined conversation functioned as a premise, not as a hypothesis. It was never subjected to verification. It was acted upon immediately. From a Stoic perspective, this is a failure of suspension. Epictetus emphasizes the importance of withholding assent when impressions are unclear. An imagined dialogue is precisely such an impression. It presents content without evidence. The appropriate response is not belief, but restraint. To delay judgment until an actual interaction occurs. Without this restraint, the mind moves prematurely from possibility to certainty. The cost is not only epistemic, but relational. You begin to relate to others not as they are, but as you have prescripted them to be. Their real responses are filtered through the expectations already established. Even neutral behavior may be interpreted through the lens of the imagined exchange. This narrows perception. You no longer encounter the person directly. You encounter your model of them. The conversation you eventually have, if it occurs at all, is shaped by prior internal rehearsals. You may interrupt, anticipate, or dismiss based on lines they never actually spoke. In this way, imagined conversations do not remain private. They alter the structure of real interactions. They constrain openness. They reduce the capacity to observe without distortion. The other person becomes predictable, not because they are, but because you have limited what you are willing to see. This produces a rigid form of certainty. And rigidity, in Stoic terms, is not strength, it is error. Strength lies in alignment with reality, in the ability to respond to what is, not to what is assumed. When imagined dialogue replaces actual evidence, that alignment is lost. The correction requires a reordering of sequence. First, event. Second, observation. Third, judgment. Imagined conversations invert this order. They begin with judgment, construct a fictional event to support it, and then proceed as if observation had occurred. The Stoic discipline restores the proper structure by removing invention from the evidentiary chain. No internal dialogue, however detailed, qualifies as proof. The persistence of imagined conversations depends on a specific confusion, the conflation of emotional intensity with evidential weight. An internally constructed dialogue often carries a strong emotional charge. The imagined tone may be sharp, dismissive, or approving. The pacing may feel immediate. The responses may appear precise. These features give the impression of realism. Yet none of them contribute to validity. They increase vividness, not truth. This distinction is critical. The mind tends to treat what feels real as if it were real. Emotional clarity is mistaken for factual clarity. A sharply imagined insult feels equivalent to an actual insult. A vividly anticipated rejection feels equivalent to a real rejection. The boundary between simulation and event becomes blurred. Once blurred, the internal scenario acquires authority. You do not merely entertain the imagined exchange, you respond to it. You experience irritation, anxiety, or satisfaction as if the interaction had occurred. These responses reinforce the sense that something real has taken place. The emotional reaction becomes secondary evidence, further stabilizing the initial construction. But the entire structure is self-generated. The imagined conversation produces the emotion. The emotion then appears to validate the conversation. There is no external input at any stage. The system is closed. It feeds on itself. From a Stoic standpoint, this is a compounded error, false impression followed by unexamined assent, reinforced by emotional attachment. Epictetus identifies impressions as the starting point of disturbance. The discipline lies in examining them before granting assent. Here, examination is bypassed entirely. The impression is not only accepted, it is elaborated, repeated, and emotionally invested in. This repetition deepens conviction. Each time the imagined dialogue is revisited, it becomes more detailed. Additional lines are added. Tone becomes more defined. The sequence becomes more coherent. With each iteration, the scenario feels less like invention and more like memory. This is a critical shift. Memory carries implicit authority. What is remembered is rarely questioned with the same rigor as what is imagined. When a constructed dialogue begins to feel remembered, it gains stability. You may refer back to it as if it were an actual exchange, using it to justify further judgments or decisions. At this stage, the distinction between fiction and event is effectively lost. The mind no longer treats the dialogue as hypothetical. It becomes part of the narrative through which you interpret the other person. Their identity, in your view, is shaped by words they never spoke. This has two consequences. First, it reduces the need for verification. If you believe you already know how they think or respond, there is no incentive to test that belief. Direct interaction becomes unnecessary or even undesirable. The imagined conversation replaces inquiry. Second, it hardens expectation. Future interactions are approached with a fixed framework already in place. Any deviation from the imagined script may be dismissed or reinterpreted to fit the established narrative. This is how error becomes entrenched. The Stoic corrective is not to eliminate imagination, but to reclassify it. An imagined conversation must be recognized strictly as an internal event. It has no authority beyond revealing your current mental state. It cannot provide information about another person. To maintain this boundary, a precise distinction must be enforced. What is felt is not what occurred. What is vivid is not what is verified. What is repeated is not what is proven. Without this distinction, the mind substitutes intensity for evidence. The result is a form of certainty that is entirely detached from reality, yet experienced as fully justified. The more compelling the internal dialogue, the more resistant it becomes to correction, precisely because its source is internal and continuously accessible. The discipline required is therefore continuous. Each time an imagined exchange arises, it must be identified as such and denied evidential status. No matter how detailed, no matter how emotionally persuasive, it remains a construction. It does not qualify as knowledge. The structural weakness of imagined conversations becomes most visible when examined under the criterion of accountability. In any real exchange, there are two independent agents. Each introduces unpredictability. Each can resist, clarify, contradict, or remain silent. This mutual independence is what gives an interaction evidential value. It creates the possibility of correction. You may be wrong, and the other person can demonstrate that you are wrong. Imagined conversations remove this condition entirely. There is no independent agent. There is no external constraint. Every element within the exchange is authored by the same source. As a result, the dialogue cannot produce new information. It can only rearrange what is already present within your own assumptions. This eliminates the possibility of correction. Without correction, error persists unchallenged. The imagined other cannot introduce facts you do not already accept. They cannot surprise you with a perspective outside your current framework. Even when you simulate disagreement, the boundaries of that disagreement are predefined. This creates a closed epistemic system. A closed system is self-consistent but not necessarily true. It can generate coherent conclusions that never encounter reality. The imagined conversation feels productive, it moves, it develops, it resolves, but it does not test itself against anything external. From a Stoic standpoint, this is a violation of disciplined judgment. Epictetus requires that impressions be tested before assent is given. Testing requires exposure to what is not under your control. It requires engagement with something that can resist your interpretation. Imagined dialogue offers no such resistance. It is therefore incapable of verification. Consider the role of contradiction. In a real conversation, contradiction forces revision. You must adjust your understanding in response to information you did not anticipate. This is how knowledge develops, through contact with what exceeds your expectations. In an imagined conversation, contradiction is simulated, not encountered. You decide when the other person disagrees, how strongly they argue, and whether their position is ultimately persuasive. Even if you construct a strong opposing view, its strength is still derived from your own cognitive resources. It cannot exceed what you are already capable of generating. Thus, the system cannot expand beyond itself. This limitation has a practical consequence: it creates the illusion of preparation without the substance of it. You may believe you are ready for a conversation because you have rehearsed it internally. But the rehearsal has not exposed you to genuine unpredictability. It has only refined your expectations. When the actual interaction occurs, the gap becomes apparent. The other person does not follow the script. Their responses may be irrelevant to your preparation. They may introduce concerns you did not consider. They may remain silent where you expected engagement, or engage where you expected withdrawal. At this point, the imagined conversation reveals its insufficiency. It did not prepare you for reality, it prepared you for itself. The confidence derived from it was misplaced, because it was never tested against an independent source. This is why Stoic discipline places emphasis on present evidence rather than anticipated scenarios. The proper object of judgment is what is occurring now, not what might occur. To base decisions on imagined dialogue is to substitute speculation for observation. It is to act on what has not happened as if it had. The corrective is structural, not emotional. You do not need to suppress the generation of imagined conversations. The mind will produce them. What must be suppressed is their elevation to evidential status. They must be treated as non-binding, non-informative with respect to external reality. They carry no authority over action. Only what has been observed, or what can be directly tested, qualifies as a basis for judgment. Anything else remains provisional. Imagined dialogue, by definition, cannot be tested until it is replaced by an actual exchange. Until then, it remains speculation. The final layer of error lies in authority, who is permitted to define reality. When imagined conversations are treated as evidence, authority shifts entirely inward. The mind not only generates content, it becomes the sole validator of that content. There is no external check, no independent confirmation, no requirement for alignment with events. Judgment becomes self-authorizing. This is the critical failure. In Stoic terms, authority over judgment must be disciplined, not abandoned. The mind has the capacity to assess impressions, but it must do so under constraint. It must recognize the limits of what it can legitimately claim to know. When those limits are ignored, the mind ceases to function as a judge and becomes a fabricator. Imagined conversations accelerate this shift. They provide a continuous stream of internally generated data that appears structured, contextual, and responsive. This gives the impression that the mind is engaging with something external. But in reality, it is only interacting with itself. This produces a false expansion of knowledge. You begin to believe you understand others without having encountered them. You assign motives, predict reactions, and interpret silence, all based on dialogues that never occurred. The scope of what you claim to know increases, while the basis for that knowledge disappears. This is not ignorance in the absence of thought. It is ignorance produced by uncontrolled thought. Epictetus draws a strict boundary between what is given and what is added. What is given is the impression, raw, immediate, unverified. What is added is the judgment, your interpretation, your conclusion. In imagined conversations, both layers are internally generated. There is no given from the outside. The entire structure is additive. Because of this, there is nothing to anchor judgment. It floats, supported only by coherence within the system. If the imagined dialogue is internally consistent, it feels justified. But consistency without correspondence to reality has no evidential value. This is the central Stoic requirement: correspondence. A judgment must correspond to what is. Not to what is plausible, not to what is vivid, not to what is internally coherent, but to what has actually occurred. Without this correspondence, judgment is detached from reality, regardless of how convincing it appears. Imagined conversations fail this requirement completely. They do not correspond to events. They correspond only to prior beliefs. They are recursive, belief-generating scenario reinforcing belief. At no point does reality intervene. The practical effect is a narrowing of agency. When you act on imagined evidence, your actions are constrained by assumptions rather than informed by facts. You may avoid opportunities, escalate conflicts, or withdraw engagement, not because the situation demands it, but because your internal narrative dictates it. This reduces adaptability. Stoic discipline values responsiveness to the present moment. To respond accurately, one must perceive accurately. Imagined conversations distort perception by overlaying it with pre-constructed interpretations. The present is no longer encountered directly, it is filtered through what you have already decided. This creates rigidity in action. You are no longer adjusting to what unfolds. You are executing a script derived from prior imagination. Even when reality diverges, the tendency is to force alignment, to reinterpret events so they match the internal narrative. This is how error perpetuates itself. The correction requires a reassertion of proper authority. The mind may generate possibilities, but it may not certify them as facts. Certification requires external reference, something that exists independently of your thought. Without that reference, all internally generated content remains provisional. Imagined conversations must therefore be stripped of authority. They can be observed, analyzed, even used to identify personal assumptions, but they cannot be used to define others, predict outcomes with certainty, or justify action. Their role is diagnostic, not evidential. Once this reclassification is enforced, the structure stabilizes. The mind returns to its proper function, evaluating impressions in relation to reality, not substituting itself for reality. Judgment regains its constraint. Action regains its grounding. And the boundary between what is thought and what is known is restored. The distinction is exact and cannot be relaxed. An imagined conversation is not an event. It is not evidence. It is not knowledge. It is a mental construction, useful only insofar as it reveals the assumptions from which it was built. To treat it as anything more is to abandon the discipline required for accurate judgment. Throughout, the error has followed a consistent pattern: invention mistaken for observation, emotional force mistaken for proof, internal coherence mistaken for correspondence with reality. Each step removes the mind further from what is actually present, replacing it with what is merely plausible. Epictetus does not prohibit thought, he restricts its authority. The task is not to eliminate internal dialogue, but to deny it evidential status. No matter how detailed, no matter how convincing, it remains unverified until tested against an external event. This is the final standard: what has occurred takes precedence over what is imagined. Without this standard, judgment becomes self-referential. With it, judgment remains anchored. The difference is not subtle. It determines whether you act in alignment with reality, or in response to a narrative that never existed. The discipline is simple, but not easy. Do not treat what you imagine as proof of what is.